Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of Divine Poetry. So today's episode is yet another corollary or a derivative video of the main body of parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. So because all of church history seems to be prefigured by all of the Old Testament in chronological order, then the end of the Old Testament, where you have the books of the Machabees being what seems like a solid prefigurement for the Second Vatican Council, that takes on some more significance here because the one specific event that I'm referring to that's so significant is the Abomination of Desolation, which appears on the second altar in the temple in the books of the Machabees. If you remember, they were Hellenizing Jews who wanted to modernize their religion. They stripped the temple of all its ornaments. Women thrust themselves into the holy places. And then Antiochus, the evil Greek king, he comes into the temple, erects a second altar, and then he makes a profane sacrifice on that second altar, and that is the Abomination of Desolation. Well, in church history, we have all those things happening in the Vatican too. So therefore, the very, I guess, likely or the very possible identification of the Novus Ordo rite as being in church history, our Abomination of Desolation, that is very significant because, for many reasons, because it's mentioned in the book of Daniel, but also because our Lord references both the book of Daniel and the Abomination of Desolation in the Gospel of St. Matthew. So I guess before I start this video, let me read that quote first from our Lord. Okay, this is from chapter 24, verse 15. When therefore you shall see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, he that readeth, let him understand. So the abomination of desolation happened in the Old Testament, but apparently also our Lord's warning us that it's going to happen again. And when we do see it, then look to the book of Daniel. So that's what I want to do today. I do want to say a couple things before I start also, is that I don't think that there's just one fulfillment of this prophecy. I think there are many, in fact, more than I probably can count or even are aware of at all. In my 7 years of playing around with this prophecy, because I'm so interested in it, I've noticed it in many different places, but it's harder to kind of explain, and I'm not going to try to do that with many of them. But I will mention the one in particular that I think is very convincing is with the Anglican revolt, or the English revolt of Henry VIII and then Elizabeth I in the 1500s. So, first of all, there's many parallels between the Second Vatican Council and what happened in England in the 1500s with Henry, and I'm sure many of you are aware of these things. So I'm just run through a couple of them. So the Novus Ordo rite, first of all, is said to be very similar to the Cranmer rite that the English put in place in the middle of the 1500s. And I don't know all the details about why, but I mean, the minister flips around and faces the people, and many of the prayers were altered just like they were at Vatican II. And there's many videos about this on the internet, so I'm not going to try to duplicate the information. Another amazing parallel is that the Cranmer rite and the Anglicans took over all of the Catholic churches, just like the Vatican II sect did with their Novus Ordo rite. And they also put a new second altar in the churches in Cranmer's time, just like they did at Vatican II. Also, almost all of the bishops went along with Henry VIII and the Act of Supremacy, where he said he was the head of the Church of England. Almost all of them, I think all of them, did go along with it. And then St. John Fisher and a couple others did recant of that and said that was wrong, and they did penance for it, and they also repudiated the new false religion of Henry VIII. And that's similar to Vatican II, where if not all, then most of the bishops went along with the documents of Vatican II, and then similarly, some of them recanted, like the Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre recanted as well, and I'm sure there were many others. Forgive me if I'm forgetting some I'm just trying to paint a general set of parallels here. I know I'm missing a lot of specifics, but it's just getting the point across in a way that's hopefully convincing. And again, one more I'll throw in there, this one as well, that the persecution was severe in both cases. So the Vatican's reaction to the Tridentine Mass after Vatican II was severe, but then it lessened over time, and they started to accept the indult, right, or other other semblances of traditional Catholicism. They lessened their severity towards them, and the same thing happened in England as well. Over time, after the initial physical persecutions of the English of true Catholics, that lessened after a while. I don't know exactly when, but there was a time in the future that they could practice their faith again with a little more autonomy and less restriction. Anyway, so there are some parallels there. So that made me wonder, though, that I wonder if you could find the prophecy there as well. And I'll try to present that at the end of the video because I think you can. But before I do that, let me go to what I believe is the preeminent fulfillment of this prophecy, and that's the one that occurs with the Novus Ordo rite in the context of Vatican II. So a couple things also I want to say before we start is that our Lord mentions the abomination in the holy place. So in the Old Testament, the holy place was clearly the temple. In church history, the only holy place in the whole world is the Catholic sanctuary, is the Catholic Church, because that is where our Lord is made present to us. That's where the Holy Mass is. That's where we receive the Holy Eucharist. There's no holier place than the sanctuary of a Catholic Church, and the tabernacle. But just trying to get the general idea. I'm sorry if I'm making some mistakes. But I think we'd all agree the church is the holiest place in the world. It has to be. So therefore, it's very significant that the Novus Ordo rite happened universally across the world in almost every single church across the world in the context of Vatican II. I mean, that would be the holy place. I would argue that it couldn't be a rebuilt third temple because that's not holy, right? That would be a satanic temple. I mean, the only holy place that we have as Catholics is the Catholic Church, and we have the abominations there. So that makes me wonder then, I was wondering this years ago, that's when I made this brochure and came across this concept, makes me wonder if the prophecy of the book of Daniel can be shown to be fulfilled in the context of church history, knowing that the Novus Ordo is the abomination of desolation. Now, before I get into some details, I guess I should probably read the prophecy, and I'm going to do that right now. So the prophecy comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 9, and it's the whole chapter long, but the very first 23 verses are kind of like an introductory or a prelude to the actual prophecy itself. I'm not going to read all of that now, it'd just be too long, so I do encourage you to go back and read that for yourself. I'm going to read where the actual prophecy starts in verse 24. And I'm also going to read you the footnotes as well, because they're very pertinent. Excuse me. Okay. 70 weeks are shortened upon thy people, and upon the holy city, thy holy city, that transgressions may be finished, and a sin may have an end, and iniquity may be abolished, and everlasting justice may be brought, and vision and prophecy may be fulfilled, and the saint of saints may be anointed. Know thou therefore, and take notice, that from the going forth of the word, to build up Jerusalem again, unto Christ the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And the street shall be built again, and the walls in straightness of times. Now the footnotes here. Verse 24, 70 weeks, that is of years, or 70 times 7, that is 490 years, are shortened, that is fixed and determined, so that the time shall be no longer. Okay, verse 25, from the going forth of the word. That is, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when by his commandment Nehemiah rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in 2 Ezra 2. From which time, according to the best chronology, there were just 69 weeks of years, that is 483 years, to the baptism of Christ, when he first began to preach and execute the office of Messiah. In the straightness of times, Augustia Temporum, which may allude both to the difficulties and opposition they met with in building, and to the shortness of time in which they finished the wall, which is 52 days. Okay, now picking up again with the prophecy in verse 26. And after 62 weeks Christ shall be slain, and the people that shall deny him shall not be his. And a people with their leader that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be waste. And after the end of the war, the appointed desolation. And he shall confirm the covenant with many in 1 week. In the half of the week, the victim and the sacrifice shall fail, and there shall be in the temple the abomination of desolation. And the desolation shall continue even to the consummation and to the end. And I'm just going to read through these footnotes here. Verse 26, a people with their leader, the Romans under Titus. So General Vespasian, who became Emperor Vespasian, he sent his son Titus to destroy the temple in 70 AD. That's what they're referring to there. Okay, in the half of the week, or in the middle of the week, because Christ preached 3 years and a half, and then by his sacrifice upon the cross abolished all the sacrifices of the law. Okay, now, the most important footnote, I think, the abomination of desolation. Some understand this to be of the profanation of the temple by the crimes of the Jews and by the bloody faction of the Zealots. Others, of the bringing in thither the ensigns and standard of the pagan Romans. Others, in fine, distinguish 3 different times of desolation. That under Antiochus, who was the evil great king in the books of the Maccabees. That when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and the last near the end of the world under Antichrist, to all of which, as they suppose, this prophecy may have a relation. Okay, so I have a lot to say. A lot going on here. So if you ever Google or Google this prophecy, you'll see a ton of Protestant interpretations of this. They're all over the place. The Protestants tend to love end times prophecies. Now, because this prophecy details 2 things: a sacrifice and a sacrifice that will fail. The Protestants have no idea what that would be, so they have to say it's a new animal sacrifice in a rebuilt third temple, because that's all that would make any sense to them. But as Catholics, we know that the only sacrifice of any importance whatsoever, the only true sacrifice, is the sacrifice of the Holy Mass. So as traditional Catholics, we also can see how that failed, in the sense that it was taken away from us at Vatican II in the Novus Ordo. And in fact, there's a quote by St. Alphonsus, and I'm not going to say it verbatim because I can't remember. I'll put it on the screen. But he says that during the time of the Antichrist, the Mass will be suspended or taken away. That's referencing this prophecy. That's where I think that comes from, is the idea that the sacrifice will fail. Of course, the Mass itself can never fail, but it can fail to be present, and I think that is what obviously happened. So traditional Catholics are uniquely positioned to see this prophecy, and that seems to be appropriate because the Bible is a Catholic book. It's written by Catholics. It was written, well, the Old Testament wasn't, but the Old Testament was fulfilled by the Catholic Church. So everything in the Bible is fulfilled by the Catholic Church or by our Lord's second coming. I'm getting off the topic here. But the point, though, is that, of course, if you misunderstand theology, you're going to misunderstand the prophecy. So the Protestants are going to have the wrong ideas of prophecy because they misunderstand the theology. They misunderstand the truths that God revealed through his church. So this makes sense. I mean, prophecy doesn't come before theology. Theology and true belief, true doctrine is all we really need to know. Prophecy is like an added bonus for those who, I guess, want to seek more, who have more curiosity. God's reasons, I don't know. But all you have to know is the actual faith, your catechism. That's always been the case, and that's always the case now. It's just amazing, though, that prophecies from the Old Testament would just simply reinforce our catechism. It would reinforce the fact that we know Vatican II is an apostasy. Of course, that makes sense. And that's why this prophecy fulfillment with the Novus Ordo is so amazing, because it vindicates the evil great apostasy of Vatican II. It vindicates our position, I guess I should say. Okay, so I have a lot to say here. I'm trying to unpack my mind in an organized way. Hopefully I'm accomplishing that. So moving on, I guess, to the prophecy itself. Okay, so the prophecy, I read it to you. Let me try to break it down a little bit. It mentions 70 weeks. Now, it does not say 70 weeks of years, although that is the traditional way of understanding the prophecy. In fact, that's what the Douay-Rheims Bible employed, was they assigned to every week a 7-year period, hence a week of years. It's a week of days is 7 days, a week of years is 7 years. And so that's why you have 490 years from the start of the prophecy, which is going forth from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until its fulfillment with Christ. Now, because we can say with some degree of confidence that the Novus Ordo is our abomination of desolation, from which we have to flee to the mountains, then we have a shoe-in or a tie-in here with this prophecy, because the prophecy deals with a timeline. It gives us a ticking timeline of something. When something starts, then you have a period of time until the abomination will appear in the middle of this final week. We do know dates from the Novus Ordo. I can identify 2 myself that I think are the most prominent ones. That's April 3rd, 1969. That's when Paul VI first promulgated the Novus Ordo. And then the second date, I go by Father Chikata's article, where he identifies November 28th, 1971, as the final day that any bishop in his diocese could permit the Tridentine Mass. By November 28th, 1971, it was effectively outlawed, and you had to use the Novus Ordo. So that means to me, it's a very fair assumption, I think, to make that. But by November 28th, 1971, every church-attending Catholic across the world would have experienced or witnessed the Abomination, Novus Ordo, on the, quote, second altar in a Catholic church. That's when it was universal. So I'm going to go with that date since that makes more sense to me. Okay, I'm going to spare you all of the detective work I did. I'm just going to show you the results because this took me, a good week or so, or maybe longer, I can't remember, to kind of put this together, but I think it's very convincing. So per the prophecy, there is a final week in which the Abomination appears in the middle of the week. Okay, so if you assume that 1971 is the midpoint of this week, and that's all we know so far, then we would have to assume that the two endpoints of the week, the beginning and the end, are significant dates, and that they would be equidistant from the middle, obviously. Okay. So I've identified two dates, February 11th, 1929, as the signing of the Lateran Treaty, and February 11th, 2013, when Benedict resigned and lightning strikes the Vatican. Now I'm going to kind of describe why I think those are significant here, but first let me say that, I'll go with this point first. So the Lateran Treaty, start with the Lateran Treaty. That was signed between Pope Pius XI and pretty much Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was trying to gain favor with Catholics because he wanted to establish a new dictatorship, the fascist regime. And so the Lateran Treaty solved a problem. The popes had no land from 1870 until 1929, and so the Lateran Treaty granted back to the Holy See a very small territory, which is present-day Vatican City. But it also did much more. It established the covenant with many, and so it made the Catholic religion, the Catholic faith, the state religion of Italy. It mandated Catholic education in primary and secondary schools. Crucifixes appeared in all public schools across Italy. Italian marriage law was adopted from Catholic canon law. And also, there's another example I have, is that Italian holidays, where they incorporated the church's feast days as Italian holidays. So the Catholic faith was confirmed with many, all of the people in Italy. So that's significant because the prophecy says that will happen. Okay, so the resigning of Benedict XVI on February 11th, 2013 is significant. Well, first of all, because there was that ominous lightning strike. And I remember that when I was still in Novus Ordo, and I wondered, that doesn't seem very good. What does that mean? Well, he was the last priest king of Vatican City. So remember, Vatican City was signed in, like I said, February 11th. The Lateran Treaty was signed, in February 11th, 1929. And so that made Pope Pius XI the very first king of Vatican City. Before that, he had no land. He could not have a temporal kingdom. He had nothing to rule over. Even though it was stolen from him, he still was landless. So he became a king, and he was, of course, a valid priest, and he was also the first king of Vatican City. There were 7 kings of Vatican City, and all of them were validly ordained priests. Now, 5 of them were anti-popes, but they still were validly ordained priests. So there were 7 priest kings of Vatican City. And you have Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, then you have your anti-popes, John XXIII, Paul VI, JP1, JP2, and then Benedict. I think I got all 7. So when lightning strikes the Vatican, when Benedict resigns, and there's a neat and clean there's a beginning and an end date, and both of them are exactly 42 years away from 1971, which was the year that the Novus Ordo appeared in the holy place. Now, Francis, you might say, is he a priest king? Well, I guess you could say he's the king of Vatican City, although he shuns any kind of he wants to look, quote, humble. He's not. But also, he's not a validly ordained priest. He was ordained in a new rite of consecration, which is not valid, so he's not a priest. So he's not a priest king. He was different than Benedict. Okay, so if that's the final week, then we should be able to go back, the other 69 weeks to see if there's a decree to rebuild. And that would be 69 weeks times 7 years, and so that would be 483 years. Now, I do recognize that the last week is comprised of 7, quote, days of the week, but each day is a 12-year period, not a 1-year period. I don't have an answer for that, but the prophecy does not specifically say that it has to be a year. It just simply says 70 weeks. It doesn't say that each week has to be the same length of time. I guess a week just simply constitutes a period of 7. So I guess technically speaking, it could fit. I know it seems a little unusual. I don't know what to say. But anyway, so if you go back 483 years from 1929, you come to the year 1446. So that was the time when the city of Rome was in great disrepair. The Avignon papacy had happened prior, and the papal schism. Rome was neglected, and the buildings were all very old. St. Peter's Basilica, which was built by Constantine in the 300s, was dilapidated and falling down. So Pope Nicholas V, who was elected 1 year later in 1447, he decrees the rebuilding of Rome. He decrees a brand new basilica. He's the one who announced the building of St. Peter's Basilica, the one that we know and see in the Vatican today. He's the one who announced that. He also rebuilt the walls and the roads and everything. So clearly, he's decreeing the rebuilding not of Jerusalem, but of Rome, because Jerusalem was the Old Testament prophecy fulfillment. Church history would have to be Rome. That's the place where our, quote, temple is, our, quote, high priest. That's the place where our religion's centered. That's the holy city for us. So it makes sense that it's the decree to rebuild Rome that's the launch off of this prophecy. So I'd say it amazingly. There it is. Now, there's some more details to that, but if you want to see more, you can just kind of check out my brochure. I have it all on the brochure. I'll link a video that I made years ago in the comment section, so you can check that out, because I'm missing some details here, but I think that's enough to kind of paint the picture. Now, with the Cranmer Rite, okay, so I'm going to go back to what I said in the beginning. So remember I said this prophecy seems to be preeminently fulfilled with Vatican II, because there can be no greater fulfillment than a universal abomination that appeared in the whole world's churches. The Cranmer Rite happened in a localized England, right? But I wondered if the prophecy could be seen to be fulfilled there as well. So the Cranmer Rite was put on the altar, on the second quote altar in the formerly Catholic churches, I guess, by the Anglicans in I think it was 1552. I think that's a date I remember. Oh, I should have better notes. Anyway, I went back 69 weeks from that date, and lo and behold, it's amazing. In 1070, so the Normans, if you remember your history, 1066, remember that's the Norman conquest of England. The Normans took over England. And in doing so, they decreed the rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral. They decreed that, and I think it was 1070. Work began. And so they rebuilt it, because the first structure was very, very old. It was built in the late 500s. So they wanted to rebuild a new Canterbury Cathedral. That's the English's preeminent cathedral. That's the flagship cathedral of England, was the Canterbury Cathedral. They decreed its rebuilding in 1070, and they finished it in 7 years. So there you go. The decree to rebuild Canterbury Cathedral starts the start of the prophecy in England, and it comes to a fulfillment with the abomination on the second altar in English history. Now, that's not a preeminent fulfillment. It's a second tier one, right? I think it's a mirror one of Vatican II. There's more to that prophecy as well. I did identify a final week in there as well. I think, if I remember, it's the Act of Supremacy and the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth, but I don't have that done yet. Maybe by the time I post this video, I'll have some kind of like graphic made for this. But it's not really important, though. The important part is I'm going to show the Novus Ordo fulfillment. I think I covered everything. Whew. I guess I'll leave it there. Glory be to God, and Ave Maria, and I'll see you next week.